Let's use the squat as an example of how we're going to run through these priorities. The squat is an excellent example of an exercise that people often say, this is how you squat, this is a bad thing to do when you squat. So we'll look at this concept of no right or wrong way to do an exercise, but rather is the way that we're doing it going to work the muscles that we want to work? So is it going to be effective? And also, is it comfortable? Does it reduce pain? Is there pain? So is it safe? The first priority that we talked about was neutral spine. So when we're squatting, we want to see, can we maintain a neutral spine throughout our squat? If we watch my squat here, you can see that I can squat down and maintain a neutral spine up to a certain point. Once I've hit that point, I lose my neutral spine position. And for me, what happens is my pelvis starts to tuck underneath, my lumbar spine starts to flex. Losing my neutral spine as I squat could happen for one of probably two different reasons. The first is that I just don't have the physical ability to squat to that depth. The hip joint is a ball and socket joint, just the acetabulum in your hip, this socket, and then you have the head of your femur, your leg bone that comes into that. And then you get a ball and socket joint. It allows for lots of range of motion. Now if you have a very deep and narrow opening in your acetabulum, then as you squat down and your femur starts to come up, they might actually run into each other. And that stops you from further hip flexion. And if you can't flex your hip further, then you're just going to tilt your pelvis so that you can get farther down in your squat. So that would be like, for example, I'm here, I'm squatting down, let's say it's right here, where I run out of space to squat farther, because I can't actually move farther in that ball and socket joint. I'm just going to tip the whole pelvis underneath so that I can keep dropping down into a squat. Somebody who has a nice open acetabulum or socket can squat a lot farther before any contact might occur. So that person is going to be able to squat naturally lower and maintain a neutral spine. That's something that we can tinker with stance width. Typically, if you do a very narrow squat, you might run out of space fairly soon, and as you open it up, because of the shape of our femur and the angle that it comes into that socket with, it allows us to move farther before we get any of that potential contact between the femur and the acetabulum. The other likely scenario is that I just don't have the body awareness or body control to maintain a neutral spine as I squat down. So I don't know what it feels like to maintain a neutral spine, or I can't feel when I'm losing my neutral spine at some point in my squat. And that's something that we can train. It comes from practice, it comes from watching yourself maybe, or having somebody watch you. Another way that you can do it is you grab a dowel, stick it along your spine. If you're standing here nice and neutral, you can pay attention to where that dowel is on your back, or what's the relationship between your back and the dowel. And then as you squat down, you see, well, can I maintain that relationship as I squat down? Or at some point, am I losing that relationship? So that's the neutral spine in the squat. Then we can look at joint alignment. Normally with joint alignment, we're looking at the parts of the body that are moving. And in our squat, that's stuff in our legs. There is not a right or wrong stance to have in your squat. It's really going to come down to, we already talked about, maybe a wider if you have trouble getting to depth, maybe narrower if you just like squatting narrow. Doesn't really matter. What's important with your stance is that wherever you end up with your feet, when you squat, we typically want the thigh and the foot to point in the same direction. So if I choose to do a narrow squat and I squat down, my thighs are pointing straight ahead, my feet are pointing straight ahead. If I want to do some sort of wider stance, as I squat down, I look at what direction are my thighs pointing. I'll make sure that my feet are pointing in that direction as well. If you see somebody set up for a sumo squat, very wide, the thighs are going out very far to the side, so the feet are going to point in that same direction, so you get a wider, more open stance as you get wider with your foot placement. Once we figured out how wide do we want to be, let's start at the feet and work our way up. So alignment of the feet means we're going to keep an even weight distribution on the front of our foot and the back of our foot, on the inside of the foot and the outside of the foot, and on the right foot and the left foot. So total even weight distribution throughout our feet. Then when we come up with our ankle, if we're keeping that even weight distribution with our feet, that's going to keep our ankle from rolling in or rolling out. But that's something that we would look at when we're evaluating a squat on what kind of joint alignment are we doing. Knee alignment, typically you want the knees to be on this line, hip, knee, ankle. What we wouldn't want is for the knees to come together. We also wouldn't want the knees to be excessively out. You can see as my knees come in that I lose that even weight distribution on my feet. When my knees come out too far, then I lose that even weight distribution on my feet. My feet are coming up. So we're going to find some knee distance or knee width tracking that allows me to keep that very even weight distribution on my feet. When we look at this knee alignment, this is where people tend to have problems, is with knees coming in with feet rolling in. So a common cue that you'll hear in a squat will be knees out. Knees out is great if you already have knees in. If your knees track along this line of hip, knee, ankle, toes, when we looked at the thigh and the foot pointing in the same direction, if you get your knee on that line, then you're good. And now we get into the really exciting part of squats, and that's mechanics. Let's look at a couple different versions of a squat that have the same spine control, the neutral spine the whole time, the same joint alignment, and the same range of motion. And we'll look at how mechanics can play a role in what that squat ends up looking like or feeling like. In version number 1, I'm going to let my knees bend first, and then I'm going to go down as far as my knees let me go. Then I'm going to flex in my hip and squat down. Then I can stand back up again. Start with the knees, let myself sit down, stand back up. Version number 2, flex in my hip first, and then lower myself down, come back up. Flex at my hip first, lower myself down, come back up. Version number 3, knees and hips at the same time. Knees and hips together, squat down, come back up. 3 different squat mechanics, same spine, same joint alignment, same range of motion. If you try those, you'll probably find that version 1, especially when you're loaded, is the least comfortable version. When we're doing a squat, we're loading up joints in our hips, knees, ankles, and feet. We're putting stress in the muscles that work around those joints. If we start by bending the knees, then this initial load is going to come through our quadriceps. If we have any sort of tracking issues with our patella or our kneecap, then that's going to get exacerbated because we're putting more load initially through the quads. So the quads are pulling that kneecap tight into the front of the knee, and if it's not tracking smoothly or if it moves in a funny direction, that force that's there or the friction that's there is going to get increased because we've loaded up the quads first. Not comfortable. So if we can break at the hips first, we can absorb most of that initial load with our glute max, and then there's less pressure or less force going through the knees. The trade-off is if we load with the hips first, we stick our hips back, we're essentially doing a good morning. We're putting a lot of extra stress through our lower back. And maybe our back is strong and can handle this. We're definitely reducing the stress on the knees, but we're increasing the stress somewhere else. So what we can do instead is at version 3, get them pretty much simultaneous. So you get lots of that initial loading through the hips, but you're not hinging so far forward that you're putting extra stress on your lower back. So we can see that mechanics in the lowering or the eccentric phase of the squat can make a difference to how we experience that squat in our knees. Same thing on the way up. So let's get back to this squat. Version 1, I'm going to come up with my knees first. So I squat down, extend the knees, push my hips forward. Squat down, extend the knees, push the hips forward. Squat down, extend the knees, push the hips forward. In version number 2, I'm going to lead this with my hips. I'm going to squat down, squeeze my hips to push myself into extension, squat down, squeeze my hips to push myself into extension, squat down, squeeze my hips to push myself into extension. Version 1 is more likely to cause knee discomfort, and moving away from that very knee-based style of squat is going to help a lot of people who do have knee discomfort when they're squatting. If somebody has that very knee-based way to squat and they stand up, they often end up throwing the knees back into full knee extension and then standing up. And that's going to be, you just stand there and do that a couple times. It's not super comfortable. Now imagine doing that with extra weight on your body. When we get into full knee extension, the bones can just rest on each other. If we leave them soft, then the soft tissue around that joint is going to support it. So our muscles around our knees are going to support the knee. Now add weight to your squat and think of all that weight of your body plus what you're squatting, bones just on bones, more likely to be uncomfortable. So if we can squat without throwing the knees back like this, it's going to be a lot more comfortable. It is possible to do that squat, driving with the hips, and not ever fully extend the knees. So they keep them soft, straight but soft, and that can take a lot of pressure off the knees and make squatting a lot more comfortable. The next thing that we'll look at mechanics with the squat, can we make this even more glute max based in how we do our squat? So if we think of glute max, we know that it has two main actions. One of them is hip extension. Hip extension is the hips coming this way. That's what's happening. So here, this is actually hip flexion. As we stand up, this is hip extension as our leg comes back into the standing position. The other thing that glute max does is it externally rotates the leg. That would be from here to here. That's hip external rotation, and that's something that glute max does. If I keep my feet on the ground, I can get external rotation. This would be squeezing butt cheeks together. Think of like gears turning. If you think of that happening in your legs and your hip, that's external rotation. If we can get that built into our squat, it'll one, help with joint alignment, and two, help with making this a more effective glute max exercise. If we look at that joint alignment, if I'm doing hip external rotation, and this is me squeezing my butt cheeks together in an external rotation-y kind of a way, it turns my legs out a little bit. If we're squatting and the knees come together, or even if I just bend my knees, I can internally rotate my hip and the knees are coming together because of hip internal rotation. If I do external rotation, it'll drive my knees out. So I can get this good alignment to happen from my hip, starting at the core of the body, get external rotation, and drive myself into this position where I have good tracking. So now my hip, knee, ankle, and my toes are all on the same line, and I'm getting that out of the hip, out of this external rotation. Instead of thinking, okay, my feet are crashing, so I'm going to move my feet and my ankles and then my knees. You could do it that way, it gets you into alignment, but it doesn't increase your glute max activation in your squat. If you think from the core out, get that hip external rotation, and then that brings the rest of the limb into alignment. The other cool thing about hip external rotation is if we get into the bottom of the squat, or in the whole position, I think that external rotation position, when I do that, it actually drives me up just a little bit. So I can actually get a little bit of pop out of the bottom or up out of the hole to get this squat accomplished with hip external rotation. Getting lots of glute max activity in a squat when we do it that way.